My sourdough saga this week includes the good, the bad, and the ugly of sourdough bread baking. Glad you're here. My name is Diane Lalomia, and this week I'm making some sourdough bread from red fife and hard white wheat, freshly milled flour. I'm not an expert by any means. As a matter of fact, I'm trying to figure out the perfect loaf. A lot has changed this week, and it's not only the weather. The first wet snowfall came pre-dawn, and it reminded me to slow down and enjoy the moment, especially since I plan to stay home and bake. Sourdough has taught me about time and patience. You just can't hurry sourdough, but you can plan around your schedule and not the dough's. Take the time to enjoy the process of baking sourdough and the feel of the dough. Let the baking bring you peace. Not all starters are created equal. I ditched the first one I'd forgotten to feed, and I opted for Mamma Mia that lives in the fridge. I fed her 50 grams of starter, 50 grams of flour, and 50 grams of water and left her on the counter to double in size. Now I'll grind my flour, 420 grams of red fife. It's considered a heritage wheat, not as old as ancient, but it's before modern wheat. I grind 10 to 15 grams more than I need for a recipe to account for milling loss, that little extra. My Nutri-Mill Classic grinder is a breeze to operate. I muted the sound while I ground the flour all mixed together. I measured out 675 grams for my recipe, and I had just a tablespoon or two left extra. For 80% hydration, I measured 526 grams of water. A handy tool when making sourdough or any bread is a Danish dough hook. I use it to mix the flour and water together for the first step known as autolyse or autolyse. I start with 78% of the water in the recipe, and the other 2% is added later with the salt. I cover the bowl with a shower cap, and I start hydrating my dough when I feed my starter. Then I'm done in the kitchen for 4 or 5 hours. It's just flour and water, so it won't hurt. In the meantime, UPS brought me a new book, The Perfect Loaf by Mauricio Leo. I hope I pronounced it right. 2 smaller bannetons and a gnocchi board were delivered too. My starter was ready, doubled, bubbling, and ready to bake. I was busy checking out my new book. Time sure has a way of slipping by. Now I measure out 2% salt and 2% of the water, which was 13.5 grams. Close enough. I use about 100 grams or so of the starter. This is 20% of the total based on the formula I'll share in a minute. I mix the salt water into the dough by hand using a pinching method, and then I mix the starter the same way. I cover it and let it rest for an hour. I do 4 stretch and folds before dinner, sometimes while I'm prepping our meal. How quickly the dough develops depends on time and temperature. The first set of stretch and folds, I use water instead of flour when handling sourdough. Freshly milled flour, especially with bran, is thirsty and needs a lot of hydration. More flour makes for a denser loaf, so resist the urge. Working my fingers under the dough and getting a handle, I just lift the dough and let gravity pull and stretch the dough and then fold it upon itself. I turn the bowl 90 degrees and stretch and fold in all 4 directions around, turning the bowl as I go. Ancient and heritage wheats have a more delicate gluten structure that will develop given time. I learned that kneading Mixers and the like can be damaging to these ancient grains, especially einkorn. Don't forget to cover your dough. I let mine rest for an hour. 30 minutes is okay. Make it fit your schedule. In the meantime, I'm still searching for the perfect loaf. Of course, the first thing I check out is the recipes. This one looks promising, made with spelt. At 75% hydration, I bet he's using a sifted flour without bran. My experiment on hydration led me to a higher hydration, more like 80% for whole grain spelt flour. Well, while I'm waiting to do my next set of stretch and folds, I work on some knitting and I watch YouTube videos. Claire Saffitz made sourdough and offered me that aha moment in understanding the baker's formula. She also shed light on hydration when I noticed the flour she used was commercially milled and not freshly milled. Hers contained less bran, possibly none. It makes a big difference in hydration levels. She was using 77% hydration, which left me with a dense loaf when I tried it at that hydration. I pushed it up to 80% on my next loaf, and I could still work my dough well enough for a pan loaf. So 80% is what works for me. I'll try to explain. You see, baker's math is a formula for bakers to create recipes for any number of loaves. Sourdough has 4 ingredients: flour, water, starter, and salt. All recipes are based on flour being 100%. Just like feeding your starter was done in parts, 1 to 1 to 1, this is based on the flour. Just stay with me. I'll explain. The water depends on the hydration needed for the particular flour. The wheat berry itself, whether it is whole grain with bran, or if it's sifted, and also consider the humidity in the kitchen. It plays a role. For whole grain, and for this example, 80% is used. The amount of starter is typically at 20%, but it can vary. The salt is 2% and can be adjusted according to your taste. To make the math easier to follow, the baker's formula is done using 1,000 grams of flour. So 80% hydration is 800 grams of water. Starter at 20% is 200 grams, and the salt and extra water at 2% is 20 grams. But I didn't want to bake 2 loaves in case I messed up. So I did half of the measurements and made 1 loaf based on 500 grams of flour. I also adjusted the water to allow for 2% water to be added with the salt to make it easier to incorporate. So my initial water was adjusted to 78% for a total of 80% hydration. I'm not counting the starter, in case you're wondering, in the hydration, that is. My second set of stretch and folds are the same as the first, but the dough is much more elastic this time. Remember to use water to make handling the sticky dough much easier. Lift the dough gently, being careful not to break the gluten bonds you're working to develop in the dough. 4 turns, 1 in each direction and back in the bowl. After 4 turns, cover the bowl and let it rest another hour or 30 minutes, whatever works for your schedule. My new bannetons should allow me to make 1 recipe that I can make 2 small loaves for gifts or for experimenting. In the meantime, a closer look at my new book. I like the way it's laid out and explains everything you might want to know about sourdough. There's a lot I can learn, I'm sure. He's a former computer programmer/developer, as am I, so his analytical line of thinking is right up my alley. It's one heck of a book on sourdough, and a must-have if you really want to learn about sourdough. The third set of stretch and folds may be enough, depending on the dough's development and your time factor. 3 or 4 sets of stretch and folds are usually enough. I typically do 4 sets. Usually, I'm done with stretch and folds even before my husband knows I've started. It's that quick. The hands-on for making sourdough isn't really that much time. By now, the dough has become stretchy and developed the gluten nicely. I can tell that it's almost ready. I can pick it up and form a ball before putting it back into the bowl. I also enjoy painting in watercolor, and I find an hour of Skillshare class is perfect for me in between my stretch and folds. Doing another set of stretch and folds in between my painting, it sure beats watching paint dry. My current project is lilies and light. Back to the kitchen for the last set of stretch and folds. Sometimes I do this while starting my dinner prep. After this set, the dough will do what is known as a cold bulk ferment in the refrigerator overnight. I'll be baking my bread in a pan, so I prefer to do the cold bulk ferment in the bowl and shape it in the morning. If I were baking a bowl, a round-shaped loaf, and place it in the banneton for the cold bulk ferment, because scoring a cold dough is much easier than one that is at room temp. For me, I'm ready to start dinner and I don't have time right now. It's easier for me to do it in the morning. Baking sourdough should fit your schedule. It's much more flexible than you might think. So into the fridge it goes. Now to work on my 1,000-piece puzzle or cook dinner. The next morning, I was greeted by a very active dough. Look at the bubbles on this baby. It's time to get the pan ready with the bread grease. I got the recipe from Ellie's Everyday Whole Grain Sourdough YouTube channel. Check it out. Instead of flour on my counter, I use water to keep the dough from sticking. I carefully stretch the dough into a rectangle and then fold it into thirds like a letter. Starting at the end closest to me, I roll up the dough to form a loaf that roughly fits the pan. It will expand as it proofs, so there's no real need to be exact. Cover the dough with either the shower cap, or if you have a lid for your pan, that works too. I let my bread proof for about an hour on the counter. I'm looking for about a 75% rise. That's really all I'm looking for. I want to avoid overproofing the dough. The temperature of the room makes a big difference. The Pullman-style pans have holes on the bottom, which allows the grease to drip, so I put a tray to catch the drips. But this time I'm using the steam bake function, so the drips will fall into the water below. I'm still getting used to my new oven, so I check the internal temperature to know when my bread is done. Sourdough should be between 200 and 205 degrees internal temperature in the center of the loaf. I learned this week that I cannot eat sourdough bread, anything with yeast, even if it's wild yeast. You see, I live with histamine issues, and it's why I refer to myself as the lone zebra. This week, my mast cells went haywire, and my autoimmune condition took on a new dimension. I experienced an esophageal spasm that left me unable to swallow, and breathing was difficult. My throat felt like it had a Charlie horse, and at the same time like someone had punched me in the stomach. Needless to say, I was scared and I thought I might die. This condition is known as eosinophilic esophagitis, or EoE for short. My throat and chest hurt for days. I couldn't eat for nearly a week, except for small bites of softest food, almost liquid. I'm getting better now, and I have more information on my blog, The Lone Zebra, on Substack. It's at dianelalomia.substack.com. I go into more detail and provide resources for anyone dealing with this or Ehlers-Danlos, the zebra that doctors don't understand. In the meantime, I enjoy baking sourdough for my husband and for friends and family. I can bake, slice, and freeze, so he has bread to toast when he wants. Me, I'm sticking to quick breads, muffins, cookies, anything but yeast. I thought maybe, just maybe, wild sourdough would be different. Nope, it's still yeast. A fermented no-no, at least for me. Well, make sure to join me next time. You never know what I'm going to be up to in the kitchen, and it might be fun. So, have a great week, and in the meantime, may all your bakes be blessed. Thanks for watching.